of the largest guitar companies and musical manufacturers in the world, Fender, I think, is pretty unique in the fact that they try to push the envelope by exploring signature products with artists that may not be the typical people that you think of for a signature guitar. And I think that this is a really cool thing that they do, where they're actually celebrating more under-the-radar artists and session musicians that have been part of some of the biggest hit recordings of all time. But with Fender's initiative in mind, there is a session guitarist and producer that I'm thinking of that I think would be a perfect candidate that would fulfill the very same mission that Fender's on. It's not only somebody that was an A-list session guitarist and certainly on the Mount Rushmore of LA session guitar players, but also somebody that became an iconic producer and kind of represented a seismic shift in country music when he came to the stage. So this is my pitch to you, Fender, and to everybody who might be watching as to why there needs to be a 1964 Fender Stratocaster Dan Huff edition signature guitar. And not only am I going to tell you about why this guitar should be made, but I'm also going to build a one-to-one replica using a Fender custom shop guitar as the basis of the project, and then retrofit it with all of the appropriate modifications to match Dan's one-to-one. In order to fully understand this instrument and how it came to be, we first need to know, who is Dan Huff? Dan Huff was born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee on November 15th, 1960. He came from a musical family. His father, Ron, was a illustrious arranger, composer, and orchestrator that worked primarily in Christian music, but also did work in film and TV. Also, Dan's brother is quite an accomplished musician in his own right as well. By the late 70s and early 80s, as Dan reached adulthood, he said he always knew that he wanted to be a session musician. And he was doing lots of demos and jingles for up-and-coming artists and for television, just to put in the hours and get the extra work. He also joined the University Belmont to start to hone some of his musical craft, and was also in a well-known Christian rock band called Whiteheart. But by the time he reached the mid-80s, he decided that he wanted to take his talents to Los Angeles and was encouraged by fellow session musician Robbie Buchanan to come out to LA and that there was plenty of work to go around. It didn't take long before Dan became an A-list session guitar player and was getting called regularly by producer greats such as Quincy Jones and David Foster, and was playing on hit songs from artists such as Peter Cetera, Michael Jackson, Patti LaBelle, Michael Bolton, and more. Not only was Dan one of the most in-demand session musicians in LA, he was also flying back and forth to Nashville to continue working with many of the contemporary Christian artists that he had been working with for some time, including artists such as Amy Grant and Michael W. Smith. But by the mid-90s, this took a toll on Dan and his family, and he decided that no longer was he going to be going back and forth between LA and Nashville, and decided to relocate back home in Nashville and try to restart his career as a session musician in a brand new, seemingly different landscape of country music, in trying to find a path there where he could continue to work as a studio guitarist. It wasn't long after Dan moved back to Nashville that he got a call from a producer that he had worked with many times previously, Mutt Lange, who was then working with an up-and-coming star named Shania Twain. Fortuitously, this record that Mutt called Dan to work on became one of the most important country records of its time and represented a seismic shift in the sound of country music, going from more traditional country sounds to moving toward more of country music with a 1980s rock and roll influence. Not only did Come On Over have a huge impact on Dan as a session guitarist, but it's also what ended up moving him into becoming a producer. And Mutt Lange told Dan that he had the mind of a producer and really encouraged him to hone that craft. And it wasn't until long that Dan became one of the most in-demand and influential producers in Nashville, and ended up working with artists such as Keith Urban, Rascal Flatts, Lone Star, Taylor Swift, Kelly Clarkson, Lady A among them. To fully understand the importance of this guitar, we first need to understand its history. The guitar started its life as a pristine 1964 Fender Stratocaster that Dan had purchased at Norman's Rare Guitars at the time that he moved from Nashville to Los Angeles, and almost immediately took it over to famous guitar maker and luthier James Tyler. And what Dan was going for was something akin to what he had seen Steve Lukather use, which was also a heavily modified mid-60s Sunburst Stratocaster, and wanted James Tyler to perform similar mods to him, thinking that if Steve Lukather is using this sort of equipment and gear, that it would also be acceptable for Dan to do the same thing. And Dan has even admitted that Steve Lukather was sort of the compass with which he'd sort of calibrate many of his gear and tone and even playing choices based on. There are some early photos of Dan using what looks to be the modified guitar, the 1964 Stratocaster, on a White Heart album cover. I came to find out later, though, however, that this instrument was actually belonging to Andy Brower, that used to be one of the sort of studio mates or suite mates with James Tyler when he was starting his cartage company. And Andy had commissioned Jim to build him one of these super strats along the lines of what Steve Lukather had. And you can actually see that instrument on the cover where Dan is holding a pristine mid-60s Stratocaster that almost looks identical to what he had, except for the fact that it only has one tone control instead of two. James Tyler did several modifications to this guitar and even got rid of the original pickups, as Dan has told many times. He not only removed the pickups, but put in new Seymour Duncan hot stacks, put in a bridge humbucker, presumably routing out the body for that, adding in a mid-boost preamp, putting in a Floyd Rose and locking nut, changing over the pickguard to a single-ply black pickguard, and adding several switches to enable the pickups to be wired between series and parallel, and having push-push controls to enable or disable the mid-boost, and also being able to add in the neck pickup. Again, this was all done around 1985. But fast forward to the mid-90s when Dan moved to Nashville, a lot of those things and modifications that were done were no longer that useful for Dan as a session guitar player in Nashville, where the sound was quite different, and he had some of the mods scaled back. These changes include removing the Floyd Rose tremolo system and locking nut, and restoring the guitar to its original style nut and a Wilkinson tremolo, adding in locking Sperzel tuners, a more modern style string tree. And Dan has said that this guitar is responsible for over 90% or more of everything that he's played on. So many hit songs included this instrument. It is literally something that should be in the Smithsonian. Let's now talk about the specifications of the replica guitar and compare and contrast that with Dan's actual guitar. Let's start first with the pickguard, the pickups, and the switching. What we have here are two Seymour Duncan hot stack neck pickups. This is exactly how Dan's is, using a neck pickup in both the neck and the middle position. In the bridge, we have a Seymour Duncan JB. Also, we have a single ply black pickguard. This is potentially a different manufacturer, but it is the same style pickguard. We have on the controls a volume, a tone, and another tone. On the volume control, we have a bypass for the preamp circuit. So if I wanted to be able to turn the preamp circuit on and off, I have the ability to do that with a push-push. Also in the back tone control with push-push, I have the ability to add the neck pickup in no matter what combination of pickups I have. So there are cases where I can get all three pickups if I'm in those in-between positions. Then we have three toggle switches. Dan often says that these are split positions, but they're actually a series parallel for each one of the pickups. So this one is for neck, the middle one is for middle, and then the one closest to the bottom tone control is for the bridge, and then just a classic 5-way selector. And again, as I mentioned with the first push-push, this is something that is engaging the Demeter boost that is located underneath the pickguard in the control cavity. You'll also notice that underneath the jack here, this is routed out for a battery, as there aren't any routes on the back. You might ordinarily see some battery routing underneath here where the tremolo is or alongside it, or you'll see a battery compartment. There's none of that because in Dan's guitar, the battery exists underneath the jack. It is using a VS100 Wilkinson bridge. This is what Dan would be using. His was, of course, an older version, but this is a contemporary version. And then if we're looking toward the headstock, we have more contemporary tuners. These are the same matte style Sperzel tuners that Dan used, locking tuners, and these replace the original tuners that were the more vintage style. Once you go to a Floyd Rose, the way that this guitar used to be, there really isn't any reason to change the tuner since you have the locking nut. But once he went to the Wilkinson, he wanted the tuning stability of these locking tuners, so went to that. And then we have a more modern kind of roller style string tree. That's also what's on Dan's current guitar. As far as neck profile, I would say that this is kind of a medium C. I would say Dan's is slightly smaller than this from what I remember. Of course, I could take that down if I wanted, but it felt pretty comfortable for me, so I didn't feel the need to do that. But if Fender were going to do it, I'm sure that they would match the neck profile. The decal is something that we couldn't quite replicate. I did change the decal on this guitar, and I had Joe Reggio, my friend who's an expert guitar restorer. We were able to locate the right type of decal for the era, and it had this style decal, although it was kind of the wrong color for what would have been consistent with the mid-60s. The main issue is on contemporary Fenders, the decal is really cheated down on the headstock, whereas most of the mid-60s ones are kind of cheated up. So we relocated the decal and then put some wear on it that was consistent to where you see Dan's wear on his, where it's missing certain letters in the Stratocaster, and then on the Fender, there's some dings and stuff like that in the logo that we were replicating to match Dan's most closely. Lastly, you'll notice we have black strap locks, the same way that Dan has black strap locks on his. Other things that are remarkable about what might be different, Dan's did seem to have a flatter radius, and I was able to play Dan's guitar when I was at his studio on multiple occasions. His did seem like it maybe had larger frets and was re-radiused. This is a 9.5 because this came from a standard Fender custom shop from the mid-60s. Also, this has a little bit of quarter sawn grain to it. Dan's was not that way. It was strictly a rock maple neck, but this might make it a little bit more stable from the perspective of movement of the neck. But where we are in California, there's probably not going to be a whole lot of humidity-induced changes due to the environment that the guitar is in. So I think otherwise it's pretty much a one-to-one replica. Again, some of the main things being different is just changes in manufacturing techniques over time with some of the parts, but all in all very similar. I guess one other thing in terms of the aging, this isn't made to match Dan's guitar. This is just however the guitar looked when I got it from the Fender custom shop brand new. And this is the aging that it came with. Dan's has a lot less of the orange in the transition of the Sunburst. His on the front almost looks like a two-color Sunburst, whereas when you turn it over to the back, his will look more like a traditional three-tone from that era. And that's just because of the ultraviolet light exposure kind of makes that dye all disappear and just kind of fades out really, really quickly. So that should be mentioned. So to you, the viewer and to Fender, that was my pitch for why we need a 1964 Fender Stratocaster Dan Huff artist model. I think of any of the session musicians that have signature instruments through Fender, Dan is compelling a player as anyone. His roster of artists that he's worked with, the number one hits that he's played on, the super producers that he's worked with, I think it goes without saying that he's most certainly on the Mount Rushmore of session guitar players of all time. And undoubtedly, this type of instrument and the type of player that Dan is certainly emblematic of the direction that Fender has been going in the last decade and a half in terms of who they're awarding their signature models to. And I also think it's appropriate to mention that Fender has actually already gone and taken measurements of this guitar. So presumably somewhere in the archives, this guitar as a template exists somewhere. I think as you've heard that this is a versatile instrument. It sounds fabulous. It works great if you're using it for higher gain distortion sounds or kind of mid-gain lead tones. And then of course the clean sound is to die for, and I think a lot of that is attributable to the pickup combination, the mid boost, and the way that this whole thing is wired with the series parallel thing. It's kind of amazing how Stratty this sounds, although you could argue that it is very divorced in terms of its electronics from what an ordinary Strat might be. And albeit somewhat bastardized, I think it is a representation of a classic instrument that all of us have heard, whether we know it or not. I appreciate you watching the video. If you're interested in other documentations along these lines, we have some other videos in this sort of series of pitches to major manufacturers to make certain artists' signature guitars. So you can check that out above or in the description. And if you want to support what I'm doing, my name is Mason Marangella. I am a effects pedal manufacturer for the company Vertex Effects. It's my company. We manufacture guitar pedals, and they're sold through most of the major retailers, whether that be Sweetwater, Amazon, Reverb, wherever you find pedals, you're likely to find ours. And by buying a pedal from us, it is in turn supporting the work that we do at the show. I also offer one-to-one consultations on Zoom. You can find information about that in the description and through our Patreon. I also have a masterclass about ordering your effects pedals and the best way to do that. That's available on Teachable and will also be linked in the description below if you'd like to join up and check out some of the offerings that we have there. I also have a podcast called The Chairman of the Boards, where I speak with two other professionals in the industry that are rig builders and building pedal boards and racks, and we discuss things about guitar gear, tone, and of course pedal boards, which you're welcome to join. And that's part of every podcast service, whether that's Spotify or Apple, in addition to being streamed on YouTube every single week. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.